The PlayStation 2 holds a very unique place in my heart, as it is the first console that I not only gamed on, but the first console I owned for myself. So when I was growing up, I played on my cousin's consoles and on my aunt's console. However, I never actually owned one for myself until quite late on. So late on, in fact, that the PS3 life cycle was well and truly begun. So I got mine in either late 2009 or early 2010. One of those 2 years, I can't quite remember. But what I can tell you is that when I got my PlayStation 2, it really was the defining moment of what became a journey into gaming that I thoroughly enjoyed and obviously still do. PlayStation holds such a unique place in my heart that it really is down to what started with the PlayStation 2. However, does that mean I can recommend the PlayStation 2 in 2025? I'm not so sure. The PlayStation 2 is such a different piece of hardware to recommend now, especially since PlayStation Plus is now starting to get the PlayStation 2 emulation up and running well and truly in a way that is really awesome, because I don't know if you saw, but yesterday we did the Sly Cooper Platinum Trophy, and that emulation software was fantastic, allowing me to not only remap controls but rewind in difficult situations. Because let's be honest, games have gotten a lot easier since the olden days. I don't know if we've gotten better as gamers, but games have definitely become a lot more simple. I don't think games are anywhere near as challenging as what they were back in the day. And I mean, I'm just talking about PlayStation 2. If you go back even further, games were even more difficult. And I think a lot of that had to do with how the controls were set up. They weren't very accessible. Nowadays, we have accessibility settings. We have a lot more freedom with the choices we make with the types of controls we have. So the PlayStation 2 doesn't quite fit that memo, and it is a generation where games were just a little bit more challenging. Now, I'm not saying games are going to be impossible to play, but I will say that it does take a little bit of an adjustment. I think one of the first things that I do whenever I hop into a PlayStation 2 game is invert the right analog stick controls if that option is available, because everything used to be opposite and I can't do it anymore. I'm so used to how modern games work that I needed to reprogram my brain into thinking of how these games now need to work in older situations. But obviously now we have those options on PlayStation Plus, so these games are a little bit more not user friendly, if we want to put it like that. So with that in mind, I want to answer a few questions about, is the PlayStation 2 worth it in 2025? Starting off with the actual system. Now, purchasing a PlayStation 2 in 2025 is probably the easiest part of this, because as the best-selling console of all time, these things are readily available. The PlayStation 2 is not a system that is going to be difficult for anyone to find, because they should be at every Cash Crusaders, Cash Converters, second-hand huts, or any shops that are or sell second-hand games. These are so readily available, and they are usually at a very good price. Now, what I will say though is games are starting to become a little bit more difficult to find if you don't know where to look. So if you're not going to dedicated retro game stores and dedicated retro resellers, these games are definitely starting to become a little bit more tricky to find. I can remember even as far back as 5 years ago seeing the entire row of PlayStation 2 games in somewhere like Cash Crusaders. That isn't exactly the case anymore, but that doesn't mean these games are not available either. They are still very much available, and I do think anyone looking hard enough will find the games that they want. The prices, though, are starting to creep up a little. Games that are starting to hold a lot more value in people's hearts are definitely the target of these games, because they are starting to creep up. I can think of Simpsons Hit and Run. That's starting to look a little bit more expensive. Games that didn't sell all too well but are always considered classics, like all your Silent Hill games, those games are starting to get very, very expensive, to the point of the fact that they are actually starting to look at the same prices of new games nowadays, which is ridiculous to think of. And then there are certain fringe situations where games are still relatively affordable, yet in South Africa they are a lot more expensive. So for example, any of your sports games, particularly those that are later generation life cycles, I know they hold some value overseas, but here they are just a lot more expensive. These are the games that are holding the most value, and I think this has to do with the fact that in South Africa, obviously, gaming is not an affordable hobby, and we are a third world country. There's no second way around it. We are not a country that has a lot of disposable income. So those people that want to play older games want to play the newest version of those older games, if that makes sense. So if you only have a PlayStation 2, you still want to play something that is somewhat modern, and those modern games are, for example, your SmackDown vs. Raw 2011. This is the latest wrestling game on PlayStation 2. It is the last one to be released. Then we also have things like FIFA 12, 13, and 14. FIFA 14 was the last one to be released on PlayStation 2. So those games that are the later life cycle games are those that we are seeing a lot more expensive in South Africa. I'm not entirely sure if that is something that is happening overseas as well, but I do think that the reason for this is because a lot more people have access to PlayStation 2s now, but they still want more modern experiences. I do think that trend is going to change more a little at the moment, because I think PS3s are starting to become a lot more affordable, allowing people to migrate over from PlayStation 2 into PS3. I hope that makes sense to why I think these games are starting to get more expensive, especially the later life cycle games that would have seemed like they sold a little bit more copies than more rare titles. And you will see that quite a few times that the rare titles are actually more affordable than these later sports titles, if that makes sense. But let's talk about my experience. Do I go back and play the PlayStation 2? And the honest answer here is that aside from the PlayStation 5 and PS Vita, the PlayStation 2 is probably still my most played system. I always go back to SmackDown vs. Raw 2011. I don't know what it is about this game particularly. I've had this game since launch. I love this game so much. I love the My Universe, the WWE Universe. I think I have well over 1,000 hours in this game, and I cannot get enough of it. I always go back to it. I've done the different Road to WrestleManias about 5 or 6 times each. I love this title. It just has that nostalgic feeling to me, and there are going to be certain titles that have a nostalgia attached to them, and you're still going to want to go back and play them. So for example, a game that I absolutely love, and probably one of my favorite games of all time, is Marvel's Ultimate Alliance. Now, of course, I can go get this game on PlayStation 3. However, I have seen some videos of how it doesn't look as good. It looks quite janky and the frame rate is choppy, but the PS2 version looks fantastic and plays fantastic. So for me, I don't think there's any need to go back and play the PS3 version when I still always go back to this one. Marvel's Ultimate Alliance is what got me into the Marvel Cinematic, well, more into the Marvel universe, I should say, not exactly the cinematic universe. I love the Marvel comics, and this has a massive part to play in why I do so. But there are other games that people are going to have a lot more nostalgia for that are more readily available on more modern systems. So I think about the Sly Cooper series now, with those being all available on PlayStation Plus at the moment, except for Thieves in Time, which is actually a PS3 and PS Vita title, so it doesn't even matter in this regard. Those games are a lot more playable and a lot more accessible to gamers on PlayStation 2. We are starting to get more of the Jak and Daxter games completely refurbished. I know we've had the Jak and Daxter games on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 3 for a very long time, but they are getting more up-to-date emulations with the new PS2 emulator that Sony has been implementing in PlayStation Plus. So that is going to be a more modern and a more enjoyable experience to play those games. While I still have all my Jak and Daxter games on PlayStation 2, it might be time to consider maybe moving on from those and start playing them on PlayStation 5 or PlayStation 4. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to get rid of mine, because I still believe firmly in physical copies. You will want to keep your physical copies, because eventually these games might not be available to play somewhere very far down in the future. And if you're the type of person like me that thinks that everything's just going to eventually just end, you're going to want a way to go back and play your older titles. Plus, older titles, physical games, are always going to hold some form of value. Whether it's $1 or $100, you will still always be able to get some value for your physical copy game. So, the PlayStation 2 is a system that I personally go back and play quite frequently. But unless you're a retro gamer and a gamer that loves the system and the games that are locked onto this system that haven't quite progressed over or migrated over onto PlayStation Plus, it is a very tough sell, because not only are the controls a little bit out of date, the graphics do look a little bit funky, but I mean, for me, I'm so used to it because I do it so often. But there are also systems that you can use that are going to make your PlayStation 2 games from your PlayStation 2 look better. You can get a FrameMeister or a RetroTink. Now, you are going to be looking at spending quite a lot of money if you are going to go down that path. But the PlayStation 2 for me is still a system that I love and enjoy frequently. So the question is whether it's worth it in 2025 for you. As a gamer who, I don't know what you game or what you play or how you play, the question is more likely going to be more relevant to you. It's not like the PlayStation 3 where I can still recommend it to pretty much everyone because it has so many great titles locked onto the system and so many great titles that are still very accessible to gamers. So the PS2 isn't exactly in that regard, but the PS2 for me is still a fantastic system. So at the end of the day, it's got to be that question of, are you a collector? Are you someone that wants to actually play these games? Are you someone that is going to enjoy playing these games knowing that they aren't as accessible as they were back in the day, or now more modernly if you have more modern systems? So the question definitely resides in what you as a gamer prefer. I cannot answer this question for you, but for myself, I will say the PlayStation 2 is worth it in 2025. I know that's probably not the answers you guys are looking for, but unfortunately that's the best I can do because the PlayStation 2 is such a unique piece of hardware that is in a very unique space and time at the moment in 2025. Other than that, I hope you check out the rest of Is It Worth It in 2025 because there are so many on the channel at the moment and I can't wait to see you next week. There has been a lot happening on the channel. We did the Sly Cooper Platinum yesterday, and on Tuesday we did another Top 5 Tuesday. So make sure you go check out all those videos on the channel at the moment. Thank you so much for watching, and I will check you soon.